powerlessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America. No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less than human. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another shiny new episode of Pod Damn America, the podcast by me and Anders for you. I'm Jake Flores. That's Anders J. Lee.
Anders J. Striped Shirt Lee here. We both have different striped shirts.
Oh, I didn't even notice that. That's cool. Okay.
We're like Skyping each other from different prisons, it looks like.
I was gonna say we both look like Pugsley from the Addams Family. Different Pugsleys, though, you know?
Yeah.
Different eras, one where they made him woke or whatever.
I was him.
Return Pugsley. That's you.
That's me. I was him for Halloween as a kid. Which he's really? Like, I was. Yeah, my family was the Addams Family 1 year, and he's the only one who didn't have to have any makeup applied. I think. I don't know if I would have cooperated with that.
Young boys do just kind of look like Pugsley.
It's
just
true.
have to have a 1,000-yard stare and a striped
shirt.
At
every white little boy goes from they phase from Pugsley into Bobby Hill. That's essentially what and then they finish puberty and become whoever they are. But before that, we all look the same.
He is the Bobby Hill of the Addams Family for sure.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Damn it, Pugsley. The Addams Family is kind of interesting because like when they made the new Tim Burton one that launched Jenna Ortega, there was kind of a right-wing like Sydney Sweeney ass return backlash because they made Luis Guzman into what's his name? What's the main guy's name?
The
patriarch of the Addams Family. Fuck.
Oh, Mr. Addams.
Gomez.
That's right.
I was just gonna start calling him Father Adams for this. No, Gomez. And real heads know the Addams Family is originally. I'm not sure actually if they're supposed to be like Spanish or like Hispanic. Or there's been a lot of debate around this, whether they're like Latinos or whatever. Also, because as I bring up all the time, nobody understands what any of these words mean. But Luis Guzman is his stature as a stout little weird man is actually truer to the original canon Gomez than the Raul Julia one, where he's like slender and weird. Raul Julia is fucking great in the Addams Family. But that was like a new evolution of it. And you know what? It's all fine. None of this should make anyone angry or have an existential crisis about what it means or have a Jordan Peterson, I'm crying because there's a natural order to the Addams Family and that they've changed it sort of thing. These are parts of the world we live in. Certainly you shouldn't be tweeting at me about it. And being really upset about media literacy, but let me tell you, it's happening anyway. I'm sorry to tell this story and derail whatever the fuck important thing we're going to talk about today, but something incredible happened to me this morning.
Well, can I just real quick? I think if anyone should use the term Latinx or have it applied to them, it would be the Addams Family.
Yeah,
the spookiness of it.
Yeah, because they're weird, and it's an X, which is kind of I guess because fucking Twitter guy Elon has kind of ruined this, but it's kind of a cool letter, you know?
Yeah.
It was kind of a cool letter before he did that, and now oh god.
He takes so much from us. Yeah.
He turned it into Twitter is now like non-binary, I guess. So
right.
Take that. Elmo. See, everyone's already done these jokes. It doesn't matter. I'm sure someone has pointed that out to him and it went over his head, or he just doesn't care. But let me tell you about something that happened to me on Twitter today, which is that I have been watching Alien Earth, the new TV show they made out of the Alien franchise. I'm pleased as punch that it came out just now, because as real heads know, people that know the PDA canon, that have media literacy, know that I've watched all of the Alien movies recently, and just in time for Alien Earth. So
Nice.
great. Wow. And real heads also know that life is hard and long and a nightmare, and most of us are members of the working class, and so you do stuff all day and it sucks, and you come home and your one tiny respite is that you sit with your dumb cat that won't stop biting you, and you watch something on TV to wind down, right, as you pass out and get ready to wake up and do it all over again. So I've been watching Alien Earth. There's only a few episodes out, and so it's a lot. They packed a lot into the first couple episodes. Pretty cool premise, though. It's, something happens, aliens end up on Earth. There's stuff going on with synthetics, and there's like characters that are, somewhat satirical of the like tech bro guys that are ruining everything. It's good, right? There's a moment when one character is sort of like spying on another character, and I don't want to spoil too much about it, but there's some sort of link between them. And I watched this, I rewound it 4 times to make sure that I wasn't like hallucinating, or like something was wrong with my TV. I kind of thought, like, wait, am I like playing two things at the same time? There's a a very dramatic scene when a character is saying something and just faintly, like not all the way exposed, just burned slightly into the screen. There's a character from the movie Ice Age, the CGI film from
I remember that.
thir- like 13, 14, 15 years ago.
20, about more than 20. I remember seeing it as a kid.
The original, like 20 years ago, like when we
Yeah.
were kids, right? This is actually the important detail, right? And so I'm kind of just drowsy. I'm like, oh man, life is so empty. I'm so alone. I'll reach for the stupid thing that you just look at constantly throughout the day that somewhat connects you to other people, and point out this funny experience I just had, where why in the Alien show is there this fucking weasel guy from Ice Age burned into the screen, right? So I tweet it, and I took a video of it. So I think it's very funny, because if you just look at it, it's just a dramatic scene with this like weird Pixar character guy in it. And I think a few people saw it and laughed, yada yada yada. Well, then I went to sleep, and when I woke up, I have been just steamrolled by Ice Age Twitter. People are very mad at me because I called him a weasel, and he's not a weasel. His name's Sid the Sloth. Forgive me, I haven't seen the movie in 20 years.
They've been preserved under frost for, since it came out, waiting for something like this to awaken them.
Fair enough. And you know what? I understand maybe there are some sort of thematic crossovers with that and like science fiction, like The Thing. That's the premise of The Thing. Okay, cool. And like, okay, so people explain to me what was happening. And look, I'm being a little facetious if I post something like this. I'm sure there's a reason it's in there, and I kind of vaguely remember why, but it's like funny, right? Is it a crime to be funny? Apparently. Put me in fucking jail, man. Locked away the key. So I put this on there, and people are like, they point out, some of them, what's happening, which is it there's a reason thematically it's in the show. There's characters when they were kids, they watched this TV show together. Now it's like part of their bond. So it's being used as a deliberate theme in the show. Also, I pointed out, even knowing that, that's pretty crazy. That's still, even like, that's a wild storytelling decision to like impose, a Shrek or a Minion type character just into a horror show. But apparently the guy who made this, Noah Hawley, is like, he's a wild ass director. He makes crazy creative decisions. So if you know his work, that he does stuff like that. But what's crazy about this is that this is a reference not to the movie Ice Age, right? Because there's a line of dialogue that he appears over that is like a wink to. It is a reference to the movie Ice Age 4, Continental Drift, the 4th installment in the Ice Age series, which has a 37% ranking on Rotten Tomatoes. And he's got to be like direct to Redbox type shit. This one is from the year 2012. It's 13 years ago. And I'm getting rolled by these children on Twitter for not knowing that. Clearly there's a reference to Ice Age 4, Continental Drift. You idiot, you imbecile. I was called so many names this
Continental
morning.
Drift. So they have a movie about Pangea coming apart?
I think it's, it's a cute like subtitle it's probably about that, but also about drifting away from your family or something. If I had to take one guess at it. So someone said, this is making me irrationally angry because what do you mean you watch a scene 4 times and can't figure out why they use the image? Are you stupid? Another person said, it's a very clear reference to something directly fucking shown earlier. You might have the media literacy of a toddler, right?
Wow.
Someone said, please pay attention to what you're watching. This is not a mystery if you're paying attention. Someone else said, were you looking at your phone while watching this? Yes. What do you mean? It's entertainment.
Also, media literacy of a toddler for a movie that is for toddlers.
For fucking, yeah. What do you mean? It's Ice Age 4.
And I say that as someone who saw it when I was like 11.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if you saw the first one and by the time you're seeing the fourth one, a good 7 years later, you're a tween at this point.
That's the thing. You develop like an unhealthy nostalgia from your childhood. That Ice Age, not like, Harry Potter, like most millennials.
Yeah, like normal people. But like the term media literacy though, like bums me out so hard in this regard because like I think it's like what is that? That's like a term that sounds smart, but I think it's something you hear on Twitter a lot, but you're literally getting like really angry at people and asking people, are you watching children's television correctly? Like, no, why would I be?
The first time I heard it was in class in community college where it was film literacy, and it was referring to a story. I don't know if this is a true story or not, but this is what they teach people with the history of film, is that they showed a projection of one of the first like movies, which was just a train, rolling down the tracks. And they showed it in, I believe it was Afghanistan, and everybody in the room was like, holy shit, a train's coming at us. Like they didn't know it was, because they hadn't seen it before. That's maybe it's wrong. I don't know if that actually happened or not, but that's the type of thing that it originally was supposed to mean, is like, do you know what movies are?
Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense in the Marshall McLuhan sense also, when he talks about media as technology. That's called phantasmagoria, the practice of doing that. They used to do it on like the frontier here.
Right.
And like when projector technology was just new and people would be like, oh my God, you've conjured a ghost train, which I think is where the ghost train trope from sci-fi, fantasy, and horror comes from now that I think about it. Because every once in a while there's a ghost train in a thing.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's interesting. But there are modern examples of it too, like Eva Longoria, the actress who I'm a big fan of. I remember she had an interview, I think it was on Conan like 20 years ago, talking about Desperate Housewives.
Mm-hmm.
And she said she had a relative, I believe it was her grandma, who didn't know that what was happening in the show was not real life. So like Eva Longoria in the show, her character Gabby has an affair with the gardener, and her grandma thought she was like actually doing that. And she had explained to her, no, it's not. It's a show. I mean, she also probably was senile or something, but that does, that senility can make you lose film literacy or media literacy.
Evelyn Longoria is Mexican. I think that's an abuela moment type thing where she's
said it.
heavily invested in her telenovela. That was like a joke on 30 Rock, where Salma Hayek's abuela thought she was just like really invested in a like a Telemundo thing. So Jack Donaghy had to dress up like the villain in the show to whatever. It's good.
man.
Rewatch 30 Rock. But the term media literacy, though, I've been thinking about a lot all morning, and I think it's like because we're getting into Marx today, right? We're talking about alienation, and like I don't know. I think about alienation a lot in terms of like Marx and labor politics and stuff like that, and like political economy, and things like this jump out at me, and they occur to me as like misguided like passion and meaning that previous to us having our entire existence shattered existentially by the things that Marx writes about, right? By having things become fucking belonging to just the massive global world of commodities and stuff like that, rather than us living as we were probably evolved to in a 100-person community or something. There's a reason you have a capacity to be angry at someone for not understanding a thing. Hundreds of years ago, this would have been a thing that made sense, and now we have these tools and these impulses that have no outlet and are misguided, and so we're searching for things to try to attack as like problem solvers and stuff like that. And this term media literacy, I think it's a good example of that, and it's something that people say because it sounds like it means like you're making a really good point about what's wrong with people today. But I think it sucks. I think you're actually like telling people you're not good enough at watching the TV. And it's like, that's not an admirable thing. I understand we're all like artists and stuff like that. And we appreciate, understanding texts and, oh, the Zoomers are dumb. They don't get anything. They're iPad babies or whatever. But some things are for entertainment, and it is fine to make a joke out of what was clearly intentionally supposed to be kind of funny. But you know what? I surrender. I'm not going to defend my take on my little joke about alien Earth anymore. I was wrong. His name's Sid the Sloth. He's not a weasel. Please don't kill my family.
Yeah, that is an odd. I will say that is an odd like media mashup. Alien Earth and Ice Age. I wouldn't think there's like a lot of overlap between those two. I mean, I guess a lot of people watch everything or watch anything that's like, yeah. What are they? They don't have that much in common.
Marx predicted everything. It's what is this fucking term? The joke people do like about this on Twitter. It has to do with fucking corporate entities and shit. This is happening. Probably can't prove it, right? But something else that's happening that you might overlay on top of this and think about is that Hulu and Disney are merging, right?
Okay.
And fucking Disney's obsessed with intellectual property.
Let's see what's going on.
So, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
that's probably part of it. And that sucks, actually. Right? You don't want to watch, like, the thing you're watching is just a fucking ad for another thing at all given times.
Yeah, unless it's the Walker Texas Ranger lever. They should do more stuff where it's like it's on the nose. We're making fun of this thing that we technically are allowed to now because there's a cross, there was a marriage in the corporate entities. Check out me and Andy's podcast on Conan we did a week or two ago. But something I wanted to talk about real quick is Minneapolis, Minnesota. There's a mayoral election going on. As we mentioned a little while ago, it was a foregone conclusion that Jacob gentrification, was going to be reelected for a third term as Minneapolis mayor. But Omer Fatah has waged so far a very impressive campaign and received, this has happened while I was in Minnesota, taking care of my dad, the DFL endorsement, which was a surprise to some people. However, it shouldn't have been, because going in, those were the two main candidates, Jacob Fry and Omer Fatah. Fry only had 30% of the delegates for that endorsement. And to be clear, Minnesota is weird when it comes to like electoral rules and stuff, because obviously DFL is Democratic Farmer Labor Party, as I've said a million times, but also the Minneapolis has ranked choice, so there's no primary, and the DFL does this other weird thing where they have a party endorsement. I guess this isn't super uncommon, but it's not the nomination. It's just the party saying they endorse this person, and it's done at a convention. And so this was Minneapolis's citywide convention, and Omar Fata was the clear winner that night. And it was done via, I mean, it went several rounds. It was done via like a hand vote, and Fry is crying foul, or has been since that happened, and his supporters were successful in getting the city of Minneapolis DFL party to revoke the endorsement to Fata, which is an unprecedented move, just a very pretty blatant display of favoritism, because Fata had more delegates. There was more support among the people who actually showed up to the convention. That doesn't necessarily mean the leadership is a fan of him, and that doesn't even necessarily mean he's gonna win the general election. It just means that he won the endorsement. And Jacob Fry, I don't know why they're staking so much on this, because there are instances in Minnesota of somebody not getting the endorsement and then winning not just the general election, but also winning the primary. So it's kind of like just a little stamp. It doesn't mean that much, but they are totally alienating all of these people in Minneapolis who saw this process play out, and maybe people who would vote for Jacob Fry otherwise, but they are now seeing him getting the endorsement revoked, which I guess now there's no endorsed candidate. This could be like appealed because there's the city party, then there's the state party.
It sounds like a super delegate type situation, right?
Sort of, yeah. It's process oriented stuff. That's a way of, but it's as if they're just like taking not the nomination away from Bernie, but like they're taking away his um convention speech or something, or they don't want to actually nominate him, or something like that. But it's just really stupid politics. I don't get what the angle is here. I think they're panicking, is what's happening. No one expected Zoran a few months ago, and mayors like Jacob Fry are now sweating.
There's a bylaw in the DFL book, if you don't know, that if you don't understand that his name is Sid the Sloth and he's from Ice Age 4 Continental Drift, that actually can revoke your nomination. So it's fair. The founding fathers did this for a reason.
Very important canonical text in the state of Minnesota, Ice Age.
It's cold up there.
Yeah. Relatable. But yeah, it's I think this is ultimately going to play out very well for Omar Fata, because I mean there are other candidates who are DSA endorsed who have gotten the DFL endorsement, and it does kind of open up this weird kind of uncomfortable relationship where it's like, oh, we are actually now we're kind of succeeding in limited ways of taking over a Democratic Party. Do we want to do that? Which I say by and large, DSA members at this point would say no. We just want to take advantage of Democratic parties and find ways to fuck them. But we don't want to like actually be in charge of them. And in Minnesota, the DFL can be quite progressive in some ways. So this, I think, is a good development, because this is heightening contradictions, and I think it will bode well for Fata's chances, and looks bad for Jacob Fry, especially if this ends up getting reversed somehow.
Do you think so? I mean, like, because I clearly know more about this than me. I just caught the story, in the feed or whatever. But like, this struck me as like, what's the term? Like tail wagging the dog type shit or something. Where like, do you think average people who are going to be voting will see this and think, oh, cool, like they're trying to fuck this guy? I think the reason that they would do something like this is to make it into a story and then have people who aren't paying that much attention catch it and go, oh my God, he's gotten his thing revoked. He must have be bad, right?
Maybe, but there is this something I've noticed when liberals can be kind of pushed into away from the establishment of the Democratic Party when they do stuff like this. I remember watching MSNBC before the New Hampshire primary in 2020, and there's this woman who was interviewed, and she's like, "I'm voting for Bernie, and it's honestly because of a lot of what I see on MSNBC." And she was asked, "Well, say more." And she's like, "Everything I see when I turn on is just negative against him. I don't get it. He doesn't seem that bad. I don't agree with him on everything, but you guys are so against him that it looks unfair. And I want to support that guy." And that happened with Zoran in a lot of ways. People calling him anti-Semitic nonstop. That didn't work because it was bullshit. And he looked more reasonable. But I mean, maybe because this process is so convoluted, like the endorsement process and the convention and all the delegates and all these rules and stuff, maybe it does end up being like, well, maybe, who knows if he cheated in the first place and that's why he got it revoked. That could happen. But
I
I
think
think
both of those things happen. Like what you're describing, what you're describing is good. It's also kind of like it's like the heightened contradictions argument. It's like the accelerationist argument, which I kind of agree with. But I guess there's also just this weird logic. Like when you talk to people that aren't oriented that way, that aren't like on the way to figuring out that something is up, that have kind of just been ideologically captured in some other way. Like when you're canvassing and you ask people who they're voting for, they'll often tell you like, well, I'm not voting for him because I don't think he's going to win. And it's like, that's not how voting works. Like you're not betting on who's going to win.
right.
But when I remember thinking about that a lot, like with Bernie in terms of like the arguments about delegates and stuff like that. And I don't know, like them publicizing a lot of stories that would imply that that the machine in place, that the established thing in place is not going to support him, therefore you shouldn't. Because it's some people are true believers and think that a lot of people who are like identify as liberal and not just like default to it because it's not conservative often worship the fucking Democratic Party, and they're like, if it made a decision, then it's the anti-Trump thing. We have to support it. It's probably smart. And but these are like fucking people that believe in horseshoe theory and horrible whatever shit we've been talking about since 2016, which are probably not the majority of people. I just feel like they're trying to like make people think like that more by crafting stories like this. But you know what? I could be wrong. Let's place a little gentleman's wager, right? About what happens with Fata.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of those people now in Trump 2 are pissed off. Like they're no longer just gonna go with whatever the party establishment says. Like they've been burned too many times, exactly 2 times, or more than that. But
like, I don't even feel like talking about whether those people exist in certain numbers is a good way of framing the argument. I feel like we've been doing that for like forever. Like, are people more like this or are they more like this? This is why I'm obsessed with manufacturing consent and PR, because I'm like, I think they're trying to make that thought like right now by doing this sort of stuff. And like the amount, like ever since Cuomo decided to dump a bunch of money into social media and like Twitter specifically to try to overturn Zoran, it's not like those people. It's not that they exist. It's that this is like a process, I guess. That's what I'm worried about.
Right, but it doesn't always work. And Chomsky would be the first to say that. Like propaganda is often very ineffective because if you look at public opinion, it's often very opposed to American policies. But this, I don't know. I think they're desperate in this case. Maybe they could still pull the rabbit out of the hat and get him reelected. But I think. I don't know. I think it's definitely an interesting development. We'll be following that race more closely in the coming months. But for today, we have a guest, an intellectual, an academic, a historian who wrote a book about a subject near and dear to our hearts, and that is the influence of one Karl Marx on the United States. Um, I don't know why I did this thing that a lot of us do, where I was like, yeah, Marx and Lincoln were best friends. They hung out. They smoked weed together. They were
Wow,
actually
you
in a
have no
polycule.
media literacy.
I have no media literacy on this is common among people of my ilk, is we're quick to say Marx and
You
Lincoln
never
were
read
buds.
Capital Volume 4, Continental Drift, that has a
They
weasel in it. Sorry, a sloth.
their bromance, yeah, fell apart in that volume. But there was a mutual. We'll get into this on the interview, but it was not. Unfortunately, it was not as simple as they were pen pals. But that is something we will explore among many other subjects in this very interesting sort of canon of themes, ideas, events, etc. Let's go to our interview with Professor Andrew Hartman. We are now joined by Andrew Hartman, who is a professor of history at Illinois State University and the author of Karl Marx in America. Professor Hartman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you both for having me on.
And this is a book. It's been out a little while, but really groundbreaking text. It's about 600 pages or so. Really interesting read. Why don't we start with what made you want to write Karl Marx in America?
So, since my late teens, early 20s, I've considered myself a Marxist. I got into reading Marx pretty seriously in my early 20s, even before I went to grad school to study history, study U.S. history, and it sort of shaped my politics to some degree, shaped my scholarship. But I stayed away from writing about Marx too much, at least in my serious academic work. I don't know why, it just seemed daunting, and it didn't seem like maybe the best career path. But, things change. I get tenure, and I decided that I wanted to write something about Marx. And there were these books that I was really into, these reception history books, like taking a thinker or a school of thought and seeing how that school of thought plays out in different contexts. Like my favorite in the sort of genre is American Nietzsche by Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen. Kind of a fascinating book in that Nietzsche never visited the United States, but lots and lots of Americans read and interpreted Nietzsche, and like, what does that mean in different contexts across American history? I was into that book, and I thought, well, surely someone's done such a book on Karl Marx. I mean, the most important thinker of the modern world. But nobody really had. There were books like Paul Buell's Marxism in the United States, which kind of tracked how Marxism played out in different immigrant and socialist groups across U.S. history, but nothing of the sort that I wanted to write. And so I thought, yeah, let's do this. And I thought, well, maybe this will be kind of a 250, 300-page book, much like the other reception history books. There's one on Locke in America. There's one on Adam Smith, Kenneth Burke. They're all kind of, some of them good, all kind of in the 250-page range. And so 600 pages later and 10 years later, I have Karl Marx in America. It could have been 1,000 pages if my editor had allowed such insanity, which is kind of one of the more surprising finds, is just how many people in U.S. history have read Marx, thought about Marx, tried to put Marx to use, oftentimes read him unfavorably, of course, but
Yeah, wow, the 10 years. That's quite a daunting task, as you said. I am curious what the reception has been so far, not just from leftist podcasts like this one, but from, because there's this trend now I've noticed where there's a bookstore in every city that has like a section, a political section, where they'll have like liberal books next to radical books now. It's kind of like a Trump 2 era trend, I've noticed, and I feel like your book has probably been next to Timothy Snyder or something in some of these shops. But what has the reaction been from people who aren't necessarily on the Marxist left?
The surprising thing is the book came out in late May. So I don't know, what are we talking about? 3-4 months it's been out. And it's been pretty widely reviewed, but mostly just by the leftist press. a couple of mainstream reviews, but written by leftists. And so I keep waiting for that. My last book, I wrote a history of the culture wars, was reviewed widely in liberal and conservative press, and the sort of reception was all over the map. I keep hoping and waiting for that here. I want conservatives. I want liberals to review it. I want their criticism. I haven't really gotten it yet. There was one critical review of it by Jonathan Sperber, who's a historian most famous for a biography of Karl Marx, and also he's written a really good book on the 1848 revolutions. But it was more of an academic book that was predictably critical in the sense that his major argument in that book about Karl Marx, another thick book, is that Marx is a man, a thinker of the 19th century, and his ideas don't. His ideas are no longer relevant. They haven't been relevant for a really long time. My book argues exactly the opposite. So that was kind of like a intra-left, also intra-academic, predictably critical review. But, I've been to lots and lots of bookstores talking about the book, and the reception has been interesting in the sense that predictably lots of people on the left are highly interested. Maybe there might be some sort of intersectarian debates about this or that interpretation of Marx, largely favorable. But I always get people just sort of, I don't know how you might refer to these people, normies, average Joes, not sort of political junkies, leftists like myself, who are curious, intrigued, didn't know the history, almost always ask the question, but what about the Soviet Union? And, whatever, I'm happy to have that conversation.
Yeah. Well, I wonder what Republicans would say about the way you explore Marx's relationship with Lincoln, because they're very quick now to be like, Republicans can't be racist. We're the party of Lincoln. Which, if you want to go back to that would be amazing. I would love that for the U.S. Republican Party. But a lot of people in America may not know this, but they corresponded, Marx and Lincoln. What was the nature of that relationship, and how did Marx view Abraham Lincoln?
So it was probably a more one-sided relationship. There's no evidence of Lincoln actually writing a letter to Marx, although Lincoln's ambassador to the UK during the Civil War did in fact write a letter to Marx in response. So during the 1850s, Marx wrote over 500 articles for the New York World Tribune, which it was published by Horace Greeley. This is like the magazine, the newspaper of the budding Republican Party in the 1850s. And it had a subscribership of 200,000, which was the largest in the world of any newspaper at the time. If you were a Republican or in that orbit during the 1850s, you were reading this. And so there's no doubt Lincoln read quite a bit of Marx's work, although these articles did not come with bylines, so he didn't know he was reading Marx. But Marx was the World Tribune's chief European correspondent during the 1850s. He always took a lot of interest in the United States. During the Civil War, he wrote extensively about the Civil War, and both for public consumption and also in a number of letters that he exchanged with Engels and that he exchanged with several of his comrades who had emigrated to the United States after the 1848 revolutions. And he thought very highly of Lincoln. The occasion, he wrote 2 letters to Lincoln, and the second is kind of the more famous one. It was on the occasion of Lincoln winning re-election in 1864. Lincoln's ambassador responded in very just sort of like prosaic, lawyerly terms. But Marx kind of liked Lincoln in this sense. He understood him as a small d Democrat, unlike most of the leaders in Europe at that time. So he compared him favorably to almost all leaders in Europe at that time. He was intrigued that Lincoln seemingly came from the working class, also in great contrast to what he witnessed in Europe at the time. He often sort of was like bitingly sarcastic in his interpretation of Lincoln's prose, like, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation. Marx wrote about how it was written in a lawyerly term, and it was maybe the most important document of the 19th century. And he was almost like begrudgingly praiseworthy about that as well, because he just thought that it really spoke to this sort of like democratic ethos in the Republican Party and in the United States that was fighting against the Confederacy. So he kind of liked Lincoln. They had different ideas about where the world should go. Lincoln wanted like every American to have the opportunity to own a small plot of land. That's kind of like the 19th century Republican dream. Marx thought that was something of the past and rather was looking forward to socialism, but he kind of liked Lincoln.
Well, and you mentioned 1848. Can you explain the significance of that with the history of socialism? And is there a sense in which European communists and socialists such as Marx maybe looked to America in the Civil War to kind of realize some of the hopes that may have been dashed after 1848?
Yeah, so the 1848 revolutions, these are the biggest revolutions in Europe of the 19th century for the most part, happened in over 20 European nations. Started in France and Paris, but sort of spread out across the continent. By the time it gets to Prussia, which of course is the biggest chunk of what later becomes Germany, Marx at that point was living in exile in Belgium, but he and Engels and lots of others of his more radical comrades travel back to the Rhine Valley, where they wage the Revolutionary War, and Marx restarts his old newspaper as a sort of organ of the revolution. Those revolutions were liberal to begin with, in the sense that they were trying to establish liberal democracies as against authoritarian monarchs. But it fails in Prussia. The liberals turn against the radicals and align with the monarch, align with the aristocracy, which Marx learns a great lesson from. And Marx and most of his comrades end up, either if they don't end up in prison or dying, they end up going into exile. Many in London. London becomes kind of the big city of political exiles in the 19th century, which is this kind of interesting. There could be a lot more written on that. It's kind of interesting. That's where Marx ends up. He ends up living in London from 1849 until he dies in 1883. But many of them ended up in the United States. And at first they thought that this would be a temporary sort of landing spot. They were eager to get back to Europe to sort of restart the revolutions. But that not only was that not possible because this is an era of reaction in Europe, but also they quickly realized that there were political hopes. They could realize some of their political hopes in the United States, especially around the politics of abolitionism or anti-slavery. And so lots of these, especially Germans, make their way to west along the Mississippi, eagerly join the United States once the Civil War starts, and are all about making it from the get-go a war about the abolition of slavery. And so the Western Front, in part because there were so many of these German and European radicals there, the Western Front was much more sort of ardent in its abolitionism than were Union troops on the Eastern Front.
And there is there are a lot of Germans in particular migrating to Texas at a certain point around this time. There was a possibility that Marx could have gone to Texas. Tell us the story there, and what do you think things would have been like if Marx had been a Texan?
I've told many people that I think that's a great sort of counter-historical novel in the making. Karl Marx, Texas Ranger, or something like that. I don't know. So as a young man, he had sort of toyed with the idea because there were lots of Europeans or Germans who were interested in moving to the American frontier or to the Texas frontier. Texas was its own republic at that point. He never pulls the trigger, but lots did, including lots of his eventual sort of communist friends. There's some pretty famous communists who end up in Texas, at least for a while. But of course, being communists or 19th century socialists, they're also abolitionists, and that doesn't go so well for them. And so most of them end up moving north to places like New York. It's hard to speculate. But if we want to do a sort of Marxist historical materialist reading of Marx, had he gone to Texas, it's unlikely he would have become Karl Marx.
I guess, yeah, maybe for the best. But in the U.S. in the 19th century, as with Europe to an extent too, there are a lot of these sort of utopian communities, and that's somewhat associated with socialism around that time. I know Marx was critical of utopianism. Do you know how he viewed some of the communes in the United States?
So, yeah, he famously wrote a little bit about this in the Communist Manifesto, but then even more so in some of his later writings in the 1870s, like his Gotha program critique. He was deeply critical of it in this sense. Like, he liked the idealism, and I think you could say that in maybe the 1840s, it was difficult to critique people for wanting to create their own societies outside of this growing sort of dog-eat-dog capitalist world. And this was a popular thing in the United States along the frontier or in sort of like off the beaten track parts of New York or Indiana or Tennessee. In fact, Eugene Debs, later famous as the leader of Socialist Party for a while, thought that maybe that was the best approach as well. But Marx was always critical of it because he didn't think it was embracing reality, embracing the future. He said the revolution was going to be made of the poetry of the future. And he thought that capitalism and the forces of capitalism would easily overwhelm these utopian societies. The point was to go through capitalism, and the point was for the working class people enmeshed in capitalism to organize to overthrow the system.
Right, and it's interesting because he viewed the U.S. as a site of a lot of hope, especially with the Civil War, and obviously it's a very developed country. And he thought, relative to other ones, he thought revolution would happen in the first world, as it were, first. But he also saw a lot of obstacles to socialism in the United States. How did he balance those two? On the whole, did he view it as a lot of possibility, or was he more of a skeptic of building socialism in the U.S.?
It probably depended on the day or depended on the era. So there were times, as you said, he was quite optimistic about the United States, especially like early on in the 1840s. He had read these American travelogues, mostly written by conservatives like de Tocqueville, who were quite appalled by the democratic activity in the United States as compared to Europe, and were sort of writing these books as a warning of what might come to Europe. Marx read them as like, oh, this is like a ray of hope. The idea that by the 1830s, all working class white men, he didn't talk about those qualifications, but we know these qualifications, that all working class white men could vote in the United States in the 1830s, regardless of property. That was unusual relative to Europe. And he thought, well, this is going to be the avenue to socialism potentially, because why wouldn't they vote in representatives who actually represented their values, and their values have to be socialist. And he looked, for example, to the Working Men's Party, which was developing in Philadelphia and New York City as like the first sort of socialist or harbingers of socialism. As you said, the Civil War made him quite hopeful. He thought that he always hated slavery on moral grounds, but he also believed strategically that it would be impossible to organize the working class along socialist lines as long as he put it, half the working class was branded in black skin. And so he was very hopeful that the abolition of slavery would sort of pave the way for new working class movements. And to some degree, he was right early on with the advent of the 10-hour working day. But, at other times he was quite pessimistic in the sense that, he understood that the capitalist attitude was so pervasive in the United States, even as early as the 1850s and 1860s. He understood that racism was a major problem that would be difficult to overcome. He also talked a lot about the frontier of the West. When his comrades from Germany were moving over there, he would write them sort of sarcastic letters saying, yes, but you're going to get stuck in the shit that is the West. This is like something that later historians and critics had argued, and that is that American democracy was dependent upon the Western frontier. This is a famous argument by Frederick Jackson Turner from the late 19th century. Marx, to some degree, had the same attitude, although he didn't equate it to democracy, but rather he understood that it would be difficult to organize a working class, a socialist working class, if workers always had the option, rather than to sort of grind it out and organize in factories, to just move west. So a lot of the questions that 20th century historians have been trying to answer about why no socialism in the United States, Marx kind of anticipated these.
I have kind of a question about this. I read a little bit of the book, and was thinking about what you were saying about Thoreau and Emerson in the United States. And a few years ago, I read a book about John Brown, and kind of didn't realize until I read this book that that Thoreau had was one of the people funding John Brown and stuff like that. So there is this kind of connection between Marx, theory-wise, Thoreau, abolitionism, all this stuff. But it seems to me from reading your book a little bit, there's kind of a clear image of this. There's more anarchistic theory in the United States as opposed to communism in Europe. And I was curious if you had any ideas about why that is, and why, if it relates to this frontier sort of thing that the United States has that Europe doesn't, where everything's enclosed, whereas here maybe the way things are laid out, gives a little bit more rise to the thought that led to the IWW and stuff like that, and anarcho-syndicalism. Do you think anything about that?
Yeah. I think it was certainly the case that radicalism in the 19th century, we could not identify it in any kind of along any kind of socialist lines for the most part. It's much more identifiable to how we might conceptualize anarchism or syndicalism. And I think there's definitely something to this idea that it's because it's this massive continent and people have so much more space to create their own sort of understanding of themselves and their identities. I mean, individualism takes root in the United States in ways that it really doesn't in Europe at a much earlier time. And, anarchism, I'm not sure we need to or must have this debate right now, but anarchism, I think, is much more sort of individualistic in its sort of conception of power and arbitrary power than is socialism. And there's lots of overlap in that sense between anarchism coming out of 19th century republicanism, small r republicanism, which wasn't interested in sort of smashing the state, but was always interested in curtailing any type of arbitrary power. Marx was always more interested in sort of capitalism, as yes, it might have felt arbitrary to many people at many times, and there were people acting as agents of capitalism who their power might have seemed arbitrary, but the system itself was not arbitrary. It was more systematic, and so organizing against that required something, I guess, a much more collective effort than sort of organizing against arbitrary power ever required. And I would make the case, I think I do make the case in the book, that because of Marx's ideas, American socialism does develop in a much more, by the 20th century, in much more Marxist ways that might look familiar to the European socialist parties, even if there's some pretty significant differences as well.
And was there a sense in 1917, the Russian Revolution happens? Eugene Debs has been, of course, very active in the United States for a while. Obviously, he and other American socialists are watching that revolution with interest. But is there a sense that socialism in the U.S. would come about in a different way and look different, or is it more close to the Soviet Union?
So, before the Russian Revolution, the American Socialist Party, with Eugene Debs as their perennial presidential candidate, he ran five times. it was Marxist in this sense. It was Marxist in the sense that they believed it needed to build a mass party made up of the working class to take power, take state power, and then that would allow them to sort of take over the means of production and sort of redistribute wealth. That was their lofty goal, but they believed that sort of taking state power was the route to that. But they thought that the only way to do that was through a mass political party that was organized at the grassroots. The Wobblies, that since you mentioned them briefly earlier, the industrial workers of the world, they had a much different sense that they weren't interested in state power, except insofar it was always repressing them, but rather they just believed that there should be like a syndicate of worker organizations that was sort of decentralized, and that would be like avoiding the state or even smashing the state was the best solution. The Russian Revolution changed everything in the U.S., not always for the better, I would argue, because the United States was a much different situation than Russia. But because Marxists actually took state power in Russia, it served as a great deal of inspiration to so many radicals everywhere in the world, but this includes in the United States. Lots of Wobblies recognize that, we actually do need a powerful political party to take the state. And lots of socialists move into the emerging Communist Party, which is connected to the Communist International of the Soviet Union, on the grounds that a sort of like small cadre of activists / intellectuals could be the vanguard of revolution and become less interested for a time in organizing the working class and much more interested in figuring out the sort of like correct way to build a party that would be revolutionary. And so the Bolshevik Revolution kind of changes the whole equation for lots of socialists and Marxists.
And obviously there's the first Red Scare, which happens very quickly after the Bolshevik Revolution. But it is before, Stalinism and the gulags really come about, and even collectivization. What's the pretext, the rationale from the American ruling class for the Red Scare when they don't have some of the same tropes that they'll get in future decades?
So the Bolshevik Revolution, it did put the fear of God in lots of American political leaders and capitalists. The idea that socialists or Marxists or communists or whatever could take power and appropriate their capital. This idea was frightening to them. Also, though, it served as a great excuse to crush annoying political groups and organizations and people that they had long had problems with. World War I proved the same sort of great excuse. And so the combination of World War I, in which free speech was crushed, and there were laws created such as the Espionage Act, which didn't allow people to speak out against American entry into the First World War, just complete crushing of the First Amendment. That allowed them to, for example, throw Eugene Debs in jail, diminish the power of the American Socialist Party. It allowed them both sort of federal, state, and local police forces and lots of vigilante paramilitary forces to completely wipe out the Wobblies, who had been annoying people all over the country, especially in the West, ever since its formation in 1905. So as with the second Red Scare after World War II, this was just a great excuse to crush organized labor, to crush radical movements, and also to get rid of certain individuals like Emma Goldman.
And moving forward a little bit to the Great Depression, 1929, there's a joke I like that says Marxists have predicted 10 out of the last 5 financial crises, which obviously there had been crashes before 29, but that was a really big one, and certainly after Wall Street as an institution had come into real prominence. But did Marxism in the U.S. get newfound credibility after the Great Depression began?
Yes. At a general level, the Great Depression and the widespread misery and unemployment opened up a lot of space for left-wing movements, especially the Communist Party, and especially the Communist Party after it embraces its Popular Front period, in which it It then sort of is allowed to organize within and alongside liberal institutions like unions and the Democratic Party. Marxism gains more credibility amongst serious intellectuals because it seems like capitalism is failing, and because Marx had written quite a bit, and lots of people were turning to some of Marx's writings about how capitalism inevitably generated crises. And so there's a whole sort of renaissance of political economic thought in the U.S. and elsewhere about Marx's ideas about the ways in which capitalism generates crises, sort of related to the idea that in terms of short-term profit, Marx argued capitalists would want to shed their workforce of workers. But when it came to long-term profitability and stability for the whole system, it required a workforce because the whole premise of capital was based on the exploitation of actual people working. And so this theory sort of allows Marxism to take off again as an intellectual project that helps explain the Great Depression. And then you just get all sorts of different types of ways of thinking about Marx. And it seemed like most of the serious intellectuals during the 1930s, to some degree, are engaging with Marx in their own various fields. They're sort of locking themselves away in libraries with Marx and trying to sort of make Marx fit the American situation. This is the 1930s. It's what I would describe as the biggest boom period when it comes to the American reception of Marx.
And this, of course, is when FDR comes into power and, of course, is painted as a Marxist by his political enemies. Marxists at the time. Well, there's varying views as you explore, but there's that Norman Thomas quote where he says he has carried out my policies on a stretcher. But to what extent is it true that FDR was, or his administration and government were influenced by Marxist ideas?
I would not argue they were very influenced by Marxist ideas. I would not argue FDR and the sort of New Deal administration was Marxist. They saw their mission as saving capitalism, saving American democracy, and they lumped the two together, as had most Americans by that time period. But FDR realized that at that point, that the worst enemy of capitalism in the United States were capitalists, at least some capitalists. And so his whole strategy when it comes to the New Deal was to seek ways to rein in the power of unregulated capitalism and to enhance the power of workers, because not in part because, he was somewhat of a class trader and believed that would be the right thing to do, but also perhaps more importantly, because he had come to understand, based upon this whole sort of political economic discourse, transatlantic political economic discourse in which Marxists were involved, but also even more importantly, someone like John Maynard Keynes, they'd come to understand that the long-term stability of the system required less economic inequality. It required that capitalists have just a little bit less power. And so he saw his role as president and this role of the state to rein in that power to some degree, which is why he created such enemies of some capitalists. Plenty of capitalists got on board and did quite well with FDR and his administration, particularly come World War II. But there was resistance amongst them, such as the DuPonts and those who formed the Liberty League in 1935. But FDR was way too astute to be brought down by them, and he knew that there was a lot of animosity at the oligarchs, and so he lumped together the Liberty League and oligarchy in general with the Republican Party, and by 1936 wins by his biggest margins ever.
Right, and looming in the background at that time is fascism, which groups like the Liberty League are certainly fascist adjacent. But to defeat that abroad and somewhat at home, you have the Popular Front. What opportunities did that pose for Marxists in the U.S., the Popular Front? And was the second Red Scare, to what extent was it a reaction to that sort of temporary but very real tolerance and acceptance of Marxism in the U.S.?
I see the Popular Front as pretty ironic. Like, I grew up learning history. The history of the Popular Front is like one of the greatest moments in American history because the left and liberals came together for once and defeated fascism and created like some semblance of social democracy, the only semblance of social democracy the United States has ever had. And although I still think all of that is true, in researching and writing this book, I also discovered that during the Popular Front period, lots of these intellectuals who had sort of embraced Marx began to downplay Marx and their Marxism because they were trying to sort of paint their ideas as hyper-American. And so even the Communist Party, this is the period in which they said communism is 20th century Americanism. To some degree, they're downplaying Marx. And so out of this, you get lots of interesting but sometimes anti-Marxist ideas emerging. So like the formation of American studies in the late 1930s and early 40s is a radical project, but also one very committed to the idea that you don't need Marx or like non-American or European radical thinkers to have this radical American project. And so they're turning to Thoreau, they're turning to Emerson, they're turning to like the American Renaissance. And to me, that's like an analogy for a larger thing that's happening. And that is during the Popular Front, Marx doesn't fare as well, ironically. And so I think that then in the transition to the second Red Scare after World War II means that any type of Marx in the U.S. is on life support.
Yeah, and that's also continues to be true, through McCarthyism and the secret speech, which is a big moment in socialist communist history. Khrushchev announces that he's now acknowledging that Stalin did some bad stuff when he was leading the Soviet Union. What is the reaction to that among American Marxists, and what becomes the dominant tendency here?
So when trying to understand the reception of Marx in the United States during the 40s, during the 50s, my main objective is who's reading Marx and why are they reading Marx? And I discovered that lots and lots of liberals are reading Marx very seriously, but not favorably in the greater context of establishing what they saw as American hegemony across the planet, especially as against the Soviet Union. They were very interested in inventing what becomes known as the American political tradition. And this is like one of the surprise findings, and that is that almost every liberal intellectual who still gets talked about now during the 1950s, 40s, and 50s was writing about Marx and basically trying to prove him wrong and America right. At the same time, you have all these right-wingers who are also reading Marx and actually quite seriously, unlike most of our contemporary right-wingers who don't take Marx or maybe even reading very seriously. They were reading Marx and taking it very seriously, but not in an effort to disprove him. For them, that was a foregone conclusion, but rather to lump together liberalism and Marxism, because liberalism was the real enemy of conservatives in this post-war period. They wanted to take down the New Deal and everything associated with it. And they thought that in the context of the Cold War, by lumping it together with Marxism, that would be quite effective. So against that sort of intellectual grain and against the widespread political repression of McCarthyism, there aren't a lot of Marxists, there aren't a lot of leftists who are able to do much of anything at the political, organizational level or really at the intellectual level. So I also was interested in tracing those who were keeping Marx alive favorably, and there aren't that many of them to speak of, but I focused, for example, on the Monthly Review, which is an independent socialist magazine, still alive today, still an interesting read, that started in 1947 or 48, I want to believe. Its first issue publishes an essay by Einstein on why he was a socialist. But that was a very serious, the publishers and editors of that magazine were very serious Marxists of the independent sort. And so they weren't shaped by what was happening necessarily in the Soviet Union. And then I'm interested in there's a whole history of Trotskyism in the book. because Trotskyists always made some of the most, I would say, like interesting readers of Marx. During the 1930s, they were very serious Marxists, but by the 1940s and 50s, many of them had turned away from Marx, even as they continue to read him. But some of these Trotskyists, like Raya Dunayskayeva, who I give a pretty intense reading of to the book, stayed serious Marxists even as they were attempting to distance themselves from the Soviet Union. By the time you get to the Secret Speech of 1956, though, it's the Communist Party is a shell of its former self in the United States, and any communists who are still around are basically fleeing the boat, jumping off the jumping ship. And so you have, in this period, there's not much left-wing political activism or organization. And so I was just interested in, like, where is Marx being kept alive?
And where was it in the 50s? Because that was a very tough time, maybe the hardest in American history to be a Marxist.
Just on the margins. So you might have, as I said, at the time, a pretty marginal socialist news magazine like Monthly Review, or you'd have these small subset groups like what was known as the Johnson Forest tendency, which eventually takes root in Detroit around the sort of radical fringes of the UAW. And that's where you find, for example, Raya Dunayskayeva, who was a Trotskyist. In fact, she was Leon Trotsky's personal secretary in Mexico City for a while. But she and others amongst these Marxists, and these were like Marxist intellectuals, they read several languages. They were translating Marx. In fact, they were the ones responsible for bringing the young Marx to lots of American readers by translating some of his early writings, such as the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. Among them, you had C.L.R. James, before he gets deported to England in 1953, I want to say. Grace Lee, who eventually marries a radical auto worker and becomes Grace Lee Boggs. They're all keeping Marx and Marxism alive in these small little niches. And there are several of those, but it's not really a political force to speak of until the 1960s.
And you mentioned, Trotskyists around this time. There's a phenomenon I wanted to ask you about where a lot of them end up being, maybe not a lot, but several of them have ended up becoming neoconservatives. I'm wondering what you found about that phenomenon.
It's a phenomenon I've always been very curious about. These leftists who become, in their eyes, disabused of their childhood idealism. That's the way they always frame it, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's some degree of truth, there's some degree of truth in the sense that they're betrayed by some of their comrades, so sometimes they extrapolate personal struggles of the sort that were very traumatic to them into being bigger political issues. So there's some of that. Sometimes, like, there's a reaction to horrors on the left. Like, for example, in the late 30s, when lots of these people start learning about the Moscow show trials and the purges, and basically, like, almost every Bolshevik revolutionary getting executed by Stalin in these trials, this is the kind of shock to the system that makes people sort of turn away from the whole project. But I also think that we can't overstate the fact that it just became much easier, much more advantageous, a much better opportunity to move right after World War II. During the Cold War, there were lots of economic opportunities for people who had formerly been on the left to move right. If you wanted to regularly write for Time magazine, you couldn't be a communist or a Trotskyist, but if you were a former Trotskyist, that worked really well. In fact, that was almost preferable because you had insider knowledge of the enemy, so to speak. So we can't sort of understate we shouldn't understate the importance of just opportunity. And humans are complex, so they always had ways to rationalize that, and I'm sure they believed a lot of their rationalizations. But I think this just the sort of shifting political tides and people going with those tides is the best explanation.
That kind of makes sense. I mean, like Trotsky has always been like the punching bag of the MLs and stuff like that. So if you're within that group, there's like a pick me sort of opportunity. There's like a opportunity to jump ship and like speak as a representation of the group that the right wing now wants to use you as a mouthpiece for. People do this sort of stuff all the time in group out group stuff.
Yeah, and on the one hand, some of the best work in a U.S. context about Marx and Marxism, intellectual work, are done by people who were Trotskyists or sort of like just outside the Communist Party during the 1930s. Because let's face it, the Communist Party, I think, was a force for good for much of the 1930s in the United States politically, but intellectually, they sort of directed the intellectual life of people within the party in ways that could be somewhat stifling if you're consider yourself a sort of free-floating intellectual. Free-floating intellectuals worked much better in the Trotskyist sphere because there wasn't necessarily that party discipline. But as you say, that free-floatingness was much easier then to sort of jump ship and just like move all the way to the right. They had already jumped one ship, so then jumping ship became a habit.
Yeah. Well, you write in the book about the New Left, which of course comes about in the late '60s. It's a little blurry as a millennial as to like what was the sort of dominant tendency with that. Obviously Mao. People were very influenced in the U.S. and France by people like Mao, but some of it seems a little more anarchistic. Or even social democratic when you look at Eugene McCarthy or Bobby Kennedy. But what influence did Marx in general have on the New Left of the 1960s?
Yeah, at any other period when lots of Americans are reading Marx favorably, whether it be socialists during the Gilded Age or communists in the 1930s, or even millennial socialists more recently, it makes a lot of sense. The puzzle pieces together quite nicely in relation to the larger political economy. There's a crisis of capitalism, or there's some sort of like a great amount of economic inequality in which like a Marxist reading of things makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. The 1960s doesn't have that. And so the reading of Marx in the 60s is different. And it sort of tracks with I've heard more than one historian say like the emergence of the New Left is kind of like one of the bigger surprises in American history. People at the time were quite shocked by it because there's no economic crisis. And the U.S. is embroiled in a Cold War that most Americans up until maybe 1968 were like fully in agreement with. So it's kind of a shock, right? And because the context is so different, you get lots and lots of different readings of Marx, kind of unique readings of Marx. So I kind of tracked this. In the early 1960s, you had some pretty serious intellectuals, grad students, such as the Studies on the Left magazine at the University of Wisconsin. These people read Marx seriously. They were reading the whole Frankfurt School Marxist the sort of outgrowth of Marxism from Europe and in the US very seriously. They had an approach to understanding capitalism in the state that was quite Marxist and quite critical. They innovated this theory of corporate liberalism, and that is like rather than the state and capital being sort of separate entities, they had sort of merged together, and that's what we saw in the New Deal state. And these were some of the earliest critics of the U.S. war in Vietnam because they thought that was almost the logical outgrowth of this corporate liberalism. It's also what C.L.R. James earlier had called state capitalism. So there's this serious intellectual side to the New Left early on that's very Marxist. But as the New Left grows and takes on lots of other issues, whether it's civil rights or feminism or various third world sort of solidarity movements, there are lots of just different readings of Marx. So on the one hand, you still have this anti-imperialist Marx and this focus on like the ways in which the Vietnam War and other acts of imperialism are consistent with Marx's theory of primitive accumulation, which he writes in the first volume of Capital. But you also get lots of young people who are just sort of like estranged at an existentialist level, feeling like they have no say over American society, who become quite attuned with the young Marx, who wrote about alienation. Now, the alienation the young Marx was writing about might have been different in its, he's writing about how the fact that people are estranged from their labor, whereas someone like Tom Hayden was worried about like people being estranged from American society because they had no say over its direction. But you get there's these resonances there. By the late 1960s, I think it tracks in lots of different ways. You have lots of like people reading Mao, people reading Fanon, people reading Che, and Marx might have been a part of that, but it kind of goes off in lots of different directions.
I feel like the tendency is for people to ask that question, like, why did the New Left happen? Because the assumption is that class consciousness comes from like these moments of economic crisis. And this is the opposite. But I mean, I guess I would argue maybe also, class consciousness also emerges from these moments of having tons of people go to college and have a solid middle class life and become the intelligentsia rather than like the proletariat,
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a different form of class consciousness than we tend to associate with like Marxist mass mobilization, but I would agree with you that you have all these people coming together as young people on college campuses where they're being asked to think about the world, and the world doesn't seem so great. And so like to begin with, they're attuned to the civil rights movement, the efforts to destroy Jim Crow in the South, and and sometimes their efforts to join in those movements out of solidarity, if they're crushed on the campus, as happened at Berkeley with the free speech movement, well, that informs then that, so bad things happen in the world, bad things happen in the United States. And even though we know they're bad, and even though we've been taught we have the power to make things better in our country, we can't do it. So that's an alienating experience that I think just becomes tenfold with the war in Vietnam. And so the civil rights movement and the various extrapolations of that, and then the war in Vietnam and the anti-war movement, those are just like massive developments that help explain the rise of the New Left. Whether we want to call it class consciousness or not, those are like historical developments that I think very clearly explain why so many young people would turn to the left.
That's fair. I don't know. This has me kind of thinking about like this thing, because I mean, this whole question of like Marx in America, just the left in America, the whole why no socialist party thing here. Something I've been thinking about for fucking ever. Somebody who thinks about the same stuff. And I guess the term that really like rattles around in my head is labor aristocracy, when people talk about, this being the imperial core, and there kind of being this different way that things process here, even with the working class here, because we're not the working class in like a third world country that is being extracted from by this country. We are kind of the best, kept worker bees on some level. So we have these weird distortions where you want to apply vulgar Marxism to the working class here and go, why the fuck aren't they doing it? Why aren't they getting all the pitchforks together? And to me, the best explanation is the labor aristocracy thing, where it seems to be that like that can't function if we're never really the true like kind of bottom of the rung proletariat. We're easily divided, but with limiting the scope of our imagination to this being a full accurate representation of the entire working class strata. It's easy to sell people a life where you're pretty well off. You're the middle class, quote unquote, here or whatever. What do you think about that whole concept?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. There's this whole literature on social imperialism, both relating to the U.S. and Europe, about the best way to sort of like pacify a potentially angry working class is to export that anger overseas and through the mechanisms of imperialism. And certainly, if you go back to Werner Sombart, who is the German sociologist who first asked the question in 1909, why no socialism in the United States? He made the case that, for example, American workers had roast beef. And so that might be sort of like an example of labor aristocracy, whereas, maybe at the time in France, the only people eating roast beef were people closely affiliated with the capitalist class or the aristocracy. The fact that American workers could eat roast beef on a almost daily basis, well, yeah, of course they wouldn't organize for socialism. And maybe this is one of the reasons why the sort of guardians of power get so pissed off. And when, for example, American students see themselves in solidarity with Vietnamese peasants as against the American imperial machine, I think that's like a pretty sort of like surprising and startling thing for the people who are waging these imperialist wars.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we're rounding out here, I want to ask a little bit about today. There are obviously many different reasons why there's a resurgence in Marxism, not just in interest, but people self-identifying and organizing politically as Marxists and socialists. But it seems to me it's kind of inseparable from Bernie Sanders identifying as a democratic socialist. And maybe it's recency bias, but it's really hard to think of a failed primary campaign, didn't even get the nomination, having as much influence on culture and society and politics as his. So with that in mind, this is maybe as a historian, you may not like this question, but I'm curious what you think of if back in 2015 he had not run and it had been someone like Elizabeth Warren instead. Would we still be talking about socialism? Would we be looking back to the progressives of yore instead of socialists? What do you think?
So the way I tracked the reemergence of interest in Marx and Marxism for now, it really begins big time after 2008, the financial collapse. And then also you get another spike during and right after Occupy Wall Street. Interestingly enough, because, Occupy Wall Street almost seemed more anarchist in its sort of way of organizing.
Right.
But it's in that moment when you get the growth of, like, for example, Jacobin, you get the growth of a number of podcasts and magazines and reading groups, and like David Harvey's podcast or YouTube sort of teaching people how to read Capital. All of this explodes at that moment. And so I sort of see that as a precursor to the Bernie Sanders campaign and also the rapid growth of DSA. So had Bernie decided not to run for president, I mean, that was like a match to the tinder, but Elizabeth Warren couldn't have lit that timber. And so I don't know. I think there's still this growth, but at some point, somebody hopefully would have had to come along and light that match. Bernie just happened to kind of come along at the right time and do it. And so like the growth of DSA and the growth of sort of interest in Marxism, Marx socialism, Bernie is a really important figure there, but there were these precursors that were pretty important.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I definitely remember pre-Bernie reading David Harvey, and there's different. But I think having that word socialist, definitely, I think things might be a little more diffuse in terms of the way people identify. Although there's obviously variation. But Andrew Hartman, thank you so much for joining us. The book is Karl Marx in America. Where can people find you and get the book?
Anywhere they sell books pretty much these days. The University of Chicago Press sells it off their website if you want to avoid Amazon, but I think lots of local bookstores have it in stock now. That would be my recommendation. And then, I'm on the usual social media places, Twitter. So are we still calling it
We
Twitter?
still call it Twitter.
We do. Yeah, we're them never gonna. I mean, it's by the time I relent and start calling it X, it'll probably the name will have changed again.
Yeah.
I
Why?
suspect.
Yeah.
So why? All right. Well, thank you again. Check out my other podcast, The Vanquished, at Anders Lee here on social media. You can find us at Poddamn America. Check out our Patreon. We go in depth on this stuff and other things. Jake, anything to?
Yeah, my show Laugh Block is at the Lyric Hyperion this Thursday, the 28th at 9:30 p.m. I'll put the ticket link in the bio. Please come out if you're in Los Angeles. We're raising money. I'm going to donate to Churla, the immigration rights fund. It's anti-ICE show. I'm going to dress like a black bloc Antifa and do stand-up. And got really funny comics. My friend Maggie May, she's been on Conan. My friend Anna Valenzuela, she does like Warped Tour and shit. And Alan Strickland Williams, who's hilarious. He's done everything. Yeah, come out to the show. And my cat's here. That's my other plug. Say hello.
All right. Hi, Murray. All right. It's finished.